Hello, it's Friday, January 20th, 2017. That means today is Inauguration Day. So a new president gets inaugurated. And being the election season that it was, it certainly is of topic to talk about. Certainly one of the craziest presidential election cycles ever. And I think one of the perhaps underreported topics is how technology impacted this election, and really how technology has impacted politics at all completely, for, I guess, ever since the internet really has come into the mainstream consciousness. This week was, I believe it was January 17th, was the anniversary of the day that the Drudge Report broke the story about the Monica Lewinsky affair. And the key thing I think that is missed there is that the headline of the story on Drudge Report wasn't Monica Lewinsky. The headline was Newsweek kills story. And so Drudge was reporting just as much about the fact that Newsweek decided to kill the story as much as the story itself. And I think that was the key thing there, is that where traditional mainstream media, as we've heard a lot this year, and I mean the Lewinsky story, I think that was 20 years ago now, 1997 I think is when that story broke. Even 20 years ago, the question was the media, the traditional media, giving us all the facts, and were they choosing when and what to report, either to protect or attack politicians? And I think obviously we saw a lot of that this year, a lot of accusations about the media being unfair from both sides, back and forth, and how the media has changed in the last 20 years, and obviously a lot of that has to do with the internet. So that's one big impact that technology has had on politics, is the fact that you can report more stories, that there's alternative news sources now, quote unquote alternative news sources, and how that's impacted everything. And obviously since the days of Drudge in 97, newspapers, traditional paper-based media have gone by the wayside, where obviously so much more is available online now. And then fast forward to 8 years ago when President Obama was elected. His was the first election probably definitely was the first election where social media had any impact. But even at that point, that was really the infancy of social media. And so his team seemed to be smart to leverage it at the time, and leverage it again 4 years later for his re-election. And I think a lot of other politicians were not so smart as to take advantage of that. But the real impact I think that social media has had on politics is that it used to be said that you should never discuss religion and politics, in private and polite company. I think social media has changed that, and that's probably for the better. As much as it seems painful today for all the fighting that seems to be going online, all the discussion, I think it's basically people now are getting comfortable with the idea of discussing politics and being on a virtual platform. You can say something, you can post things, good and bad, you can say whatever on your mind, and you don't get that immediate feedback of being in front of somebody. But I think it's definitely for the better. The idea of more political discourse, more discussion, I think is good. And the idea that politics should not be discussed in polite company, I think is going by the wayside. People want to discuss politics. People want to talk about their beliefs. And social media has given a way to do that on a larger scale, on a larger audience. And we get to see that people have quite a range of thoughts and ideas. And I think that can only be good for the country, for politics in general. I think we saw what happened this year with kind of the underappreciated Trump support didn't show up in the polls as much, didn't show up in many respects. However, I think if you paid attention to social media, and obviously everyone's own social media is kind of their own little island to themselves, but you get to see a variety of thoughts and viewpoints that may not be expressed in the mainstream media. And that's definitely going to continue to change as social media continues to grow, as the internet continues to grow, as people get their news sources from other places. And obviously that led to the whole fake news controversy and that sort of thing. And then the backlash from that was, well, what is really fake news? And again, that goes all the way back to the Drudge Report 20 years ago, where Newsweek decided to kill the story. They could have ran with it, but they didn't. And who knows why at this point. But again, what was fake news is not reporting news considered fake news as well. So anyway, so that's my talk about technology and politics. And obviously as technology continues to intertwine itself into society, the politics of that is only continue to explode. Obviously last year we saw the Apple FBI thing with the encryption and that sort of thing. That's stuff like that's going to continue to happen, which kind of leads to another topic with self-driving cars. That's going to be probably one of the biggest technologies that's going to impact society in a big way. And obviously driving on public roads, the rules of the road are going to change, and that's probably going to be one of the most interesting things to keep an eye on. And I bring it up here because recently there was a story several months ago of a person that was killed in their Tesla car in autopilot mode, and the government just came back and said Tesla's system wasn't at fault. It did not fail. The circumstance that happened was beyond the capabilities of the system. So basically, in effect, a tractor trailer pulled out in front of a car that was in autopilot mode. The system didn't react fast enough, and the person ran right into it. But they say that really what was at fault is the driver wasn't paying attention. And we still have to keep in mind that today's car technology is not truly self-driving yet, and you must still remain aware. So, which kind of for now seems silly. What's the point of an autopilot mode if you must be having your hands on the wheel the whole time? You're really, all you gain is that you don't have to put your foot on the gas, and if you can kind of, the car will correct itself. But if your hands are on the wheel, I really don't get it. So that's why I'm not buying any self-driving cars or any cars like that right now, until the technology matures to the point where you can trust the car to drive itself in the vast majority of situations. Otherwise, what's the point of having a self-driving car if you still have to be completely aware at all times? The car might be driving itself, but you're not gaining any benefits of that, and you're still basically a slave to your machine. So anyway, that's good for Tesla in that they were cleared of any fault in that, other than it was insinuated that they perhaps should market it differently so that the term autopilot doesn't actually insinuate that the car can completely drive itself. But they were cleared of wrongdoing, and at least that will hopefully not put a damper on public's enthusiasm for self-driving technology going forward. So we'll see about that. Now, switching gears here, if you live in the St. Louis area like I do, there was a big story just a few days ago where the St. Louis Public Library's checkout system was hit with a ransomware, and basically it shut down their checkout system so people could not check books out. And fortunately for the library, no public or private data or anything was stored in their checkout system yet. It basically shut down like several hundred computers across their citywide library network and that sort of thing. And the reporting on the news was that they were being held for ransom and that sort of thing, which technically is true. But as I was telling people, there was probably no human actually holding the data ransom. All these ransomwares are basically automated systems, so it's just another malware. which brings up the topic of malware. And of course, anytime you bring up the topic of malware, you bring up, well, what can I do to prevent it? What can I do to stop these sorts of things? And for the most part, most people, that use Microsoft Windows systems, they're just used to the idea of having an antivirus software and keep it updated. Hopefully that keeps you safe. The problem with ransomwares is that they're pretty much an extremely destructive form of a malware, where most malware, for up until the rise of ransomwares a few years ago, they had gotten to the point where they were fairly just annoying. They were mostly there to try to get you to spend money or show you ads or this sort of thing. They weren't really destroying your data. The ransomwares are very tricky in that they literally encrypt your data so that you can't see it, you can't access it anymore, and then they try to make you pay money to get the decryption key so that you can decrypt your data. So it basically is holding your data for ransom. It's destroyed it in a way that you can retrieve it, but only if you get the encryption key from them. So ransomwares have had several high-profile incidents, and I don't know how much play the St. Louis Public Library play is going to get nationally. It certainly did get some play around here locally. But really the main question is, what can you do to protect yourself? And I should say you have to look at the platform you're running. So pretty much all the attacks that we've seen on the news as far as ransomwares, or even going back to the credit card breaches of a few years ago with Target and Home Depot, and again here locally Schnucks stores, and then there was a bunch of other smaller breaches that got some news but didn't get a whole lot of attention because unfortunately it had gotten to be old news. It wasn't a big deal anymore, or at least it seemed. All those systems that had their credit cards hacked, the root cause was a Windows-based machine had some sort of malware that wormed their way into the system and was able to then defeat security and get the credit card data and transmission. And so for almost every high-profile sort of breach, hack, that sort of thing, Windows is the root, or is a commonality. And so I've asked this question before. I've written articles about it. It's like, how long is it going to take for organizations to get the point that if your platform is weak to begin with, you put yourself in a greater risk. So when people ask me, well, what can I do to protect myself from viruses? I say, well, let's look at your foundation. What operating system are you running? What type of computer system are you running? And most of the time it's Windows. The number one thing you can do to protect yourself from malware is stop using Microsoft Windows. That's number one thing, period, point blank. Stop using Windows and you take yourself out of the line of fire. I've used this analogy before. Windows is like a war zone, and if you don't want to get shot, maybe you should just get yourself out of the war zone. And for some people that's easier said than done, I understand. I mean, if you're just an individual, you can certainly buy a different type of computer, primarily an Apple Macintosh, where the incidents of any sort of malware are on magnitudes fewer. No computer system is 100% safe. However, practically speaking, your chances of getting some sort of malware on a Mac are infinitesimal, where on Windows, if you don't have good antivirus protection, just going out on the internet, they've had studies done where you will literally get some sort of malware in minutes if you aren't protected. So that's the difference. Is there's no 100% guarantee, but why live in a war zone when you can live in a peaceful suburbia? And sure, you can get shot in suburbia, perhaps, but your odds are significantly less. So that's really the number one thing, is get away from Windows if you're concerned about malware, and you will reduce your attack surface, so to speak, significantly. Now, like I said, I understand not everybody can necessarily get away from Windows, but at some point you have to start looking at it as an investment, because what what is the risk of getting some sort of malware attack, like a ransomware or something, and what's your data worth, um, versus saying, okay, we're going to put the investment in getting away from relatively insecure platform, um, or this platform that costs a lot to try to keep secure, and again, there's no guarantee, versus moving to a platform, whether that's Apple or whether it's like a Unix or a Linux type of system, something that's going to be significantly more secure, um, and protect yourself that way. So I think more and more companies are going to start looking at that. And unfortunately, I talk about Windows, but it seems the Android platform is becoming increasingly susceptible to viruses, malware, that sort of thing. There was an article that I just read. Google is taking steps to protect people from what they call uh, um, basically suspicious apps that are likely malware. And according to Google, they've already flagged over 25,000 apps that belong to various malware families. Um, and the quote is that these particular apps can degrade the Android experience to such an extent that a non-negligible amount of users factory reset or abandon their devices. So the term non-negligible, as tricky as that was to say, is basically just a softball way of saying a lot of users. So basically a lot of users are getting their devices infected with malware to the point where they need to wipe them or they just abandon them. Now that's a pretty big indictment, especially when you compare it to the other major platform, again Apple, with their iPhone and iPad devices, where there are virtually, or I should say literally, zero malwares available for that you can get on your Apple device. So it's a big difference from uh, you know 25,000 apps that Google has flagged, and there's many more that they probably haven't flagged yet, and many more that are going to be written and created. The malware game is cat and mouse, so it's going to be ongoing forever, basically. Whereas on the Apple system, as much as some people complain that the fact that Apple has control over the App Store and that sort of thing, the big upside is that there literally is no malware. For the few apps that have somehow made it through the App Store with a questionable type of intent, Apple quickly shuts it down, and that's the end of it. And you don't hear about it anymore because there's no way for that malware to spread or continue. Whereas on the Android side of things, rogue apps can exist and continue to exist very similar to the way they do for Windows. And there's nothing that the manufacturers can do to really kill them, other than, again, all you can do is try to protect yourself with some antivirus software and anti-malware software and hope that it's up to date and that it works against the flood of malware out there. So again, if you don't want to get malware, then reduce your risk and get away from the platforms that harbor malware. It's that simple. So, and it's funny, in that there was a blog article written by Microsoft, I think their German division, that I'm looking at here. They basically posted an article saying how insecure Windows 7 is and how dangerous it is to continue to use Windows 7. Very interesting coming from the company that wrote the operating system. Obviously what they're trying to do is to get people to move to Windows 10. When Microsoft does a great urgency to try to get people to 10. They have a lot of motivation to get as many people on Windows 10 as possible, because really that is the future for Microsoft, is to get people on Windows 10 and try to have a unified platform across the PCs and tablets and mobile devices. That's their great urgency. It's just kind of weird that they did it in that way, where they were trying to bash their own operating system that is still the #1 operating system in deployment out there. So clearly they're trying to get people, that huge installed base of Windows 7 users, to Windows 10, and clearly they've not been as successful as they want with that. So there's been articles in response to that saying that Microsoft's using scare tactics now to try to get people to migrate to Windows 10. And ironically, then Microsoft pulled that article and then later put it on a different URL. So no explanation been given why they did that, but clearly that's some mud on their face there. But again, the point is that even if you move to Windows 10, you're still susceptible to malware. Even if Windows 10 is quote unquote more secure, it's still full of holes that continually need to be patched. And again, compare that to the other systems in existence that are significantly less susceptible to malware. So that's that there. Basically, again, if you don't want malware, get away from the platforms that harbor it. So anyway, I think I've talked long enough today. Certainly, if you have any questions, send them to me, post them on my Facebook page, or go on my website and post them there. Happy to answer your questions, and happy Inauguration Day. I will see you next Friday.